The overhead strips were dying, flickering with the kind of high-frequency seizure that makes your teeth ache. They cast a flat, shadowless glare over the lower levels, the kind of light designed to strip away dignity and replace it with clinical depression. Elias Thorne moved through the facility's sub-basement, his boots echoing off the polymer-coated concrete with the rhythmic thud of a slow-motion execution. His new security badge was a cold weight against his pectoral, the RFID chip inside probably pinging "My life is over" telemetry back to a server in some orbital boardroom. The silence in the throat of the maximum security wing was thick enough to choke on. The Obsidian Vault isn't a prison, Thorne, it's a containment failure waiting for a reason, Holloway had told him during the briefing. Her face was a topography of deep-set wrinkles and cold, bureaucratic pragmatism. They'd stood in a briefing room that smelled of ozone and recycled air, a space so large it made your own existence feel like a rounding error. The Xylari is a bioengineered apocalypse in a state of grace. Don't talk to it. Don't even think at it too hard. You provide a mental uplink, and she'll ride your synapses all the way to the surface. She'd leaned in then, her eyes like two burnt-out fuses. And stay clear of the visual. The last tech who tried to find a soul in those amber optics ended up as a red smear on the bulkhead before he could even register the pain. 3 weeks into the shift, and Elias was already redlining. He felt the pull of the vault like a gravity well, a dark itch behind his eyes that no amount of standard-issue sedative could scratch. He spent his hours cycling through bullshit maintenance protocols, inventing ghost glitches in the HFY or phantom discrepancies in the digital logs. Anything to justify one more look through the reinforced plasteel. Anything to see the ghost in the machine. Today wasn't a scheduled sweep, it was a goddamn obsession. The thing, the woman, the weapon, was hunched in the corner of a cell that felt too small for the physics she occupied. She was a silhouette of bruised indigo and hard angles, shoulders broad enough to suggest she could bench press a maglev train. The ceiling was 10 meters up, but she made the space feel like a coffin. It wasn't just a room, it was a pressurized kill zone. In the canteen, the other meat sticks chewed their processed protein and talked about her with the kind of performative machismo that usually masks a colon-clenching terror. They called her the void-bound, the scourge, the bitch from the rim. Nobody went near the airlock without a full tactical squad and a smart gun primed for a kinetic solution. They traded stories about research assistants getting turned into wet confetti and helmets being crushed like beer cans while the occupants were still screaming. But today, the telemetry was off. She wasn't pacing, that predatory, wall-to-wall stride that usually vibrated through the floorboards of your skull. She was dead still, a statue carved out of night sky and ancient grudges. Even the sub-bass thrum of her respiratory system had gone quiet. Elias felt his heart kick against his ribs like a panicked prisoner. Standard protocol said call the medtechs, but he knew the corporate math. She was an asset, not a patient. If the asset broke, they'd just write it off and harvest the organs. He looked down the corridor, a long, grey esophagus of reinforced steel, and checked the vitals on his HUD. Her heart rate was a flat line in slow motion. Her body heat was bleeding into the deck plates. She was starving. It wasn't a technical glitch, it was a slow burn execution. A deliberate starve-out ordered by the suits upstairs. The realization hit him like a mag slug to the gut. The lab coats, with their high-end optics and ice-water blood, were watching her fade with the same interest a kid shows a dying insect under a magnifying glass. He remembered Miller and Soto laughing over their synthales, talking about how they'd rattle the bars with ultrasonic bursts just to watch the titan twitch. It was a snuff film in high definition, and he was the only one not jerking off to it. Elias had seen the dark side of the sector before. He'd done his time in the corporate wars where collateral damage was just a tax write-off. But this was different. This was refined, clinical cruelty. He didn't check in with his conscience, he just headed for the kitchens. The station's artificial night was settling in, a wash of grey gloom and neon static. He loaded a tray with the high-caloric sludge they fed the grunts, thick protein slurry, blocks of synth bread that had the structural integrity of a brick, and a liter of recycled water that tasted like a copper pipe. He walked back to the vault with the stiff, automated gait of a man who'd already accepted his own death warrant, ignoring the security alerts chirping at the edge of his vision. Near the primary airlock, a shadow detached itself from the bulkhead. It was Vance, A man with a face like a sharpened trowel and eyes that saw everything in terms of leverage. He stared at the food tray with a look that was half pity, half predatory. "You've got a death wish, Thorne. Or you're just remarkably stupid." "She needs to eat," Elias said, his voice sounding like gravel in a blender. Vance stepped into his personal space, smelling of cheap stims and unwashed synth leather. "It's a controlled burn, you idiot. Management wants to see the failure point of her metabolism. It's an order from the top." "She's a biological entity, Vance, not a stress test," Elias countered. Vance's hand clamped onto his shoulder, fingers digging into the muscle like pliers. "If you open that slot, she'll pull your arm through and eat it for an appetizer. She'll peel the meat off your bones before you can hit the alarm." Elias looked through him, focusing on the dark curve of the vault door. "I'll take the odds." "Then do us all a favor and don't scream too loud," Vance spat, stepping back into the shadows. "I'm not filing the paperwork for your remains." The feeding slot was a jagged reinforced gap at the base of the door. Elias dropped to a knee, the hard floor biting into his joints. He could feel the heat signatures of the other guards watching from the dark. Vance, Garrick, the whole pack of jackals waiting for the inevitable blood spray. Time dragged, thick and viscous as hydraulic fluid. Elias slid the tray through the gap. He didn't pull back. He left his hands right there in the kill zone, pale, soft, and remarkably easy to snap. A shadow fell over his knuckles, vast and freezing. He felt the air displace as the heavy weight moved on the other side. The audience in the hallway held their collective breath. Elias didn't flinch. He felt a touch, a sensation so light it was almost a data ghost. Indigo fingers, elongated and scarred, brushed against his skin. They were shaking with a frailty that didn't match her combat specs. He was locked in place. The contact held, a circuit closed between two separate species of victim. Then the tray was hauled into the blackness, silent as a grave. When the movement stopped, he reached in to retrieve the empty plastic. His hand hit her fingers again. She pressed something into his palm, hard and sharp. He pulled back and found a star, perfectly carved out of the synth bread. It was a piece of art made of garbage and desperation. Elias shoved the star into his pocket and stood up, his face as blank as a terminal screen. Behind him, the guards started whispering, their voices like the buzzing of a disturbed hive. The next day, he was back. "Playing mommy to the monster again, Thorne?" Garrick was leaning against the bulkhead, his face twisted into a sneer. He used Thorne's name like an insult, a way of reminding him that in this facility, you were either a predator or you were meat. "Just doing the rounds, Garrick," Elias said, eyes locked on his datapad. "Rounds?" Garrick stepped into his path, his shadow elongated and jagged under the failing lights. "The brass is starting to wonder whose side you're on. And in this place, wondering usually ends with a neural wipe." Elias stood his ground. He was a head taller than Garrick, and he let the threat hang in the air like ozone. "If Holloway has a problem, she can tell me herself." "Holloway?" Garrick barked a laugh that sounded like a dry cough. "That thing in there is a biohazard. It's killed squads of specialists. And you're bringing it snacks." Elias tried to push past, but Garrick grabbed his arm, leaning in close enough for Elias to see the burst capillaries in his eyes. "You know what happened to the last sympathizer we had? They found him in the recycling vat. He didn't even have enough DNA left to fill a vial." Elias wrenched his arm away and kept walking. "She's in your head, Thorne," Garrick yelled after him. "They find the cracks in your psyche and they crawl inside. You won't even know when she pulls the trigger." The threat just made him double down. That night, the tray was loaded. As he approached the vault, the hallway was lined with guards, their faces pale and expectant in the gloom. They were waiting for the show to start. "The bitch is waiting for him," someone whispered. "She's been at the door for hours." Elias didn't slow down. When he hit the viewing panel, he saw her. She wasn't in the corner anymore. She was a mass of indigo muscle pressed against the steel. Her presence was a localized high-pressure system, a weight that pressed against his ribs. He knelt. He looked up. She was hunched over, her massive jaw hovering near the slot. Her face was a masterclass in alien evolution and sheer, unadulterated trauma. The ridges on her skull looked like armor plating. As he slid the tray through, her eyes locked onto his. They were amber pits of high-intensity light, glowing like the core of a reactor. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of a soldier who'd seen too much. Elias felt a jolt of pure, unrefined recognition. It was like a neural handshake. She tilted her head, a slow, predatory movement that was somehow also graceful. Then she mirrored him. She knelt. She placed her massive hands exactly where his were. It was a tactical acknowledgement. She took the tray but didn't eat. She waited for the go-ahead. When he nodded, she started. The plastic fork looked like a toothpick in her hand, but she used it with a precision that made the guards in the hall look like glitchy NPCs. "She's profiling him," a voice muttered from the dark. "No," another said. "She's claiming him." From the safety of the monitoring station, Sergeant Sterling watched the feed, his face a knot of cold, professional fury. He'd been on the extraction team that brought her in, he'd seen the body bags. Seeing Thorne, this soft target, this bleeding heart, forming a bond with a Class A threat was a personal insult. Sterling's resentment was a chemical burn. He'd spent his life serving the Syndicate, trading his humanity for a pension and a set of cybernetic implants that hummed in the quiet. And the asset ignored him. Thorne was getting the engagement that Sterling felt he'd earned in blood. Every report Holloway filed, every whispered rumor in the barracks, it was all Thorne. Sterling wasn't going to let some rookie guard compromise the security of the sector just because he had a thing for indigo skin. As Elias walked away, Sterling's gaze tracked him on the monitors, eyes like thermal sights. He was going to make sure Thorne's connection ended in a high-velocity tragedy. Weeks went by in a blur of gray metal and recycled air. The feeding ritual was the only thing that felt real. He started bringing her small things, a dead comlink, a brass casing, a strip of colored tape. She treated them like holy relics. They traded in a language of kinetic cues and shared silence. It was a beautiful kind of hell. The facility was on edge. You could feel the tension in the deck plates, like a storm front moving in. The Xylari wasn't a prisoner anymore, she was a predator on a leash that was getting thinner by the hour. "She's got him wired," the lab coat said. "She's building a backdoor into his nervous system," the techs added. Holloway called him into her office. It was a cold, high-tech tomb filled with blinking servers and expensive scotch. "Thorne," she said, her voice like grinding gears. "Your psych evil is a mess. I'm doing my job. You're fraternizing with a weapon system. That's a breach of contract." Holloway stood up, her skeletal frame casting a long, jagged shadow across the desk. "The Syndicate wants results, not a romance. They don't like variables they can't control." Elias stood like a statue. "She's a killer, Thorne. It's in her DNA." She was defending herself. "There's a difference between a killer and a soldier." Holloway let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Sterling is pushing for a purge. He says you're a security risk. He says you've been compromised. Sterling is an obsessed prick who's looking for a reason to pull a trigger. Maybe. But in this facility, reasons are easy to manufacture." Holloway looked at the door. "Watch your back, Thorne. The Syndicate doesn't do mercy. Sterling's been keeping a log," she added as he turned to leave. "He's got every interaction, every calorie you've fed her. He's building a case for your termination." Elias left the office, the name Sterling burning in his mind like a hot wire. He got it now. The surveillance, the cold stares, it was a hunt. Sterling was the apex predator, and Elias was the bait. He went to her that night, his mind a mess of tactical assessments and fear. She was waiting. She had arranged his gifts on the floor. It was a schematic. A perfect layout of the facility's security grid, constructed from scraps of garbage and wire. In the center, she'd placed a blue bead and a red wire tie. Side by side. Us. But there was a threat indicator. A jagged piece of metal and gray cloth, positioned near the exit. It was a perfect representation of a sniper. It was Sterling. She knew. The asset in the cage had a better grasp of the tactical situation than the guards did. The red line hit on a night of dead air and high humidity. Elias was late, stuck behind a logistics delay. The facility felt empty, its halls echoing with the ghost sounds of a dying machine. As he hit the vault level, he heard it, the sound of petty, low-rent cruelty, shrill laughter and the smell of ozone. Miller and Soto were at the door. They were using a riot prod through the slot, sending high-voltage arcs into the darkness just to hear her hiss. "Come on, Blue, give us a show," Miller was panting, his face greasy with adrenaline. "Let's see that alien temper." Soto was filming it, his eyes glued to the screen of his handheld. Elias felt a cold, sharp anger crystallize in his chest. He moved with a silence that would have made a professional assassin jealous. "Step away," he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. The two guards jumped, their faces flashing from malice to a shaky, hollow bravado. "Just taking the edge off, Thorne. No big deal." "Get out," Elias said. "You don't outrank us, you freak," Soto spat, though he was already backing away. "I do tonight," a voice came from the dark. Captain Chen stepped out, his uniform sharp enough to cut, his face a mask of disappointment. "This is a high-sec facility, not a playground for sadists." The guards scrambled like rats. Chen looked at Elias with a weary, tactical eye. "Go back to your bunk, Thorne. This deck is hot." But as Elias turned, the world ended. An explosion of sound ripped through the vault, not a scream, but a physical rupture in the air. The door, 10 tons of reinforced alloy, buckled. The metal screamed, a high-pitched tectonic shriek. The control panel turned into a fountain of white sparks. "Containment breach!" Chen yelled, reaching for his sidearm. With a sound like a ship's hull snapping, the door was torn off its hinges. She came out. She wasn't a prisoner anymore. She was an elemental force, 3 meters of indigo rage and lightning. Her skin was the color of a bruise, her eyes were twin tactical lasers. The heavy-duty magnetic restraints snapped like brittle plastic. Miller and Soto were caught in the wake. She grabbed Miller by the throat, hoisting him up until his boots were dangling a meter off the deck. He looked like a rag doll in a hurricane. Soto tried to run, but she hit him with a strike that sent him through a reinforced bulkhead with the wet thud of a discarded steak. Chen opened fire. The smart bullet sparked off her skin, drawing thin lines of indigo blood. She turned her eyes on him. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 20 degrees. Elias stepped into the line of fire. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't shout. He stood in the wreckage and looked her in the eye. "Enough." The Xylari froze. Her chest was a bellows of kinetic energy. Her amber eyes burned into his, searching for a reason. The killing intent flickered, faded, and then went dark. Slowly, she let Miller go. He hit the deck and stayed there, curled in a fetal ball. She backed away, her massive frame trembling, her head bowed as if the weight of her own violence was crushing her. She retreated into the dark of her cell, back to her map, back to her buttons and her wire ties. The alarms were a wall of sound now, a screaming digital choir. Chen was barking orders into his comms. Miller was crying. But Elias just watched her, sitting in the ruins of her life. The Syndicate Council met in a room of black glass and filtered light. Sterling Vane was at the head of the table, his face a cold, polished surface. Holloway and the other directors sat in the shadows. "Liquidation is the only logical path," Sterling Vane said. His voice was as final as a death sentence. "It was a triggered response," Elias said from the back. Every head turned, the man who spoke for the monster. "A weapon that can breach a vault door is a liability we can't manage," the director replied. "She showed restraint," Elias argued. "She could have killed everyone on that deck." She stopped. "Restraint?" Sterling yelled, stepping out from the corner. "She crippled 2 guards. She's a biological WMD." The argument was a tactical stalemate. Sterling Vane watched Elias with a look of predatory curiosity. "You believe in this bond, Thorne? You think there's something in there worth saving?" "I know there is." "Fine. Let's verify the data." Sterling Vane smiled, a thin, cruel line. "We'll lock you in with her. No tech. No guards. Just you and the asset." The room went cold. It was an execution masquerading as an experiment. "I'm in," Elias said. They marched him to the vault. A temporary door was already being welded into place. Holloway watched him go, her eyes full of ghosts. "You're a dead man, Thorne. She won't know you in the dark." "She knows me," Elias said. The door slammed shut. The silence was heavy as lead. He was alone with the indigo titan. 4 hours, neither of them moved. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and old blood. Then she shifted. She crawled toward him, her movements heavy with a bone-deep weariness. She didn't attack. She pushed her food tray toward him. It was her own ration, untouched. She offered it to him with a gesture of such raw, bleeding-edge humanity that Elias felt his vision blur. "Elias," he whispered. "My name is Elias." She tilted her head. She didn't speak, but she touched his hand. Her fingers were cold as a surgical blade, but the contact was the only real thing in the world. For the next week, the Syndicate watched on the feeds. They didn't see a slaughter, they saw a partnership. They saw 2 casualties of the system sharing space, finding a way to survive in the dark. But the system doesn't like survivors. Sterling, driven past the breaking point by jealousy and hate, slipped into the medical bay while Elias was sleeping off a fever from the damp cell air. Sterling moved with the silent efficiency of a professional killer. He had a syringe, a high-concentrate neurotoxin that would look like a heart attack on the logs. "You messed with the natural order, Thorne," he hissed, leaning over the bed. But he wasn't alone. The Xylari, sensing the threat through the facility's failing infrastructure, had torn her way through the maintenance shafts. She breached the medical bay wall just as Sterling's thumb hit the plunger. She didn't kill him. She just took the syringe and crushed it in his hand. Then she picked Elias up, pale, sweating, and half-dead, and tucked him against her chest. She walked through the facility like a god of war. She ignored the pulse rifles, she walked through the riot gas. She carried him through a storm of kinetic fire until she hit the main airlock. She laid him down on a sterile bed and looked into his eyes. "Live," she said. The word sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. Then she put her hands up. The fallout was a mess of legalities and corporate damage control. Sterling was shipped off to a penal colony, his career and his mind a total write-off. Sterling Vane was forced out by the shareholders. The optics of the Xylari's mercy were too profitable to ignore. Elias woke up to find Holloway looking at him. "The status quo is dead, Thorne. She's being relocated to a high-sec habitat. A clean one." "And my status?" "You're the primary handler. By order of the board." He saw her one last time before the transport ship arrived. She was standing in a courtyard flooded with real sunlight, her skin like polished sapphire. He looked at her, and she at him. No more steel. No more vault. Just the sky. She took his hand, a titan and a ghost, walking into the light.